My boyfriend Tommy was obsessed with the TV series Black Mirror. It's this really dark Netflix series all about how technology can go wrong and ruin people's lives. The episodes never ended happily, so it wasn't really my thing. Tommy loved it, though. I'd hear him watching it in the other room almost every night. His twin brother, Spencer, was also a big fan. When the new season came out last month, the two of them binged the whole thing together. They spent all night watching that dark show. I couldn't handle watching a whole episode of Black Mirror. Watching an entire season in one sitting? That sounded like torture to me. Well, the day after their binge fest, Tommy tried to tell me all about his favorite episodes. I pretended to listen, but I really didn't. He got a little frustrated with me and said, "Just you wait. Some of those episodes will probably come true one day. With the way technology's advancing, it's only a matter of time." I just rolled my eyes and left the room. He was taking this fandom way too seriously. A few days later, I was on my computer when Tommy ran into my room with a panicked look on his face. "Rachel," he said, "don't do it!" Do what? I had no idea what he was talking about. He said he knew that I was going to hurt him, and he wanted to reason with me before it was too late. I asked him what the hell he was talking about. He pulled out his phone and showed me a new app that he'd downloaded. It was some sort of AI thing that answered questions about what was going to happen in the future. You just type in your name and a specific time, and it'll tell you what you'll be doing. He showed me the results for that evening. It said I was going to get really angry at him and attack him with a knife. I was speechless. How could he possibly believe something like that? It was obviously some kind of stupid joke. He looked deadly serious, though. It was like he believed that he was living in some sort of Black Mirror episode. "I'm not going to stab you," I assured him. "Trust me." He backed away, acting scared. "I think I'm going to stay at my brother's tonight," he said. This whole thing was ridiculous, obviously. I was not in the mood to deal with Tommy's paranoia. I snatched the phone out of his hands to prove that the app was made up. "Look," I said. I refreshed the app, and then I typed in my name and today's date. And then I waited for a response. It took 5 seconds for the app to respond. "You will stab your boyfriend at 6:15 tonight." "See?" he said. "It's the truth!" Obviously, this app was just joking with us. It probably predicted murder for all its users. I changed the time to 30 minutes in the future and tried again. After 5 seconds, the app replied, "You will be called into work to handle an emergency." "Okay," I said. "Let's wait 30 minutes. If my work doesn't call me, then we'll know that this app is nonsense." I was confident that nothing was going to happen. Today was Saturday, and my work never needed me to be there in person on the weekend. They'd have to pay me overtime, which is something my boss would never do. 30 minutes later, my phone rang. Tommy's eyes widened in horror. "Are you going to answer it?" he asked. I looked down at my phone and saw that it was the office calling. I answered it, and I listened to my boss ask if I could come into work. He said that our entire database had been deleted and they needed my help to recover the missing data. I knew it was just a dumb coincidence, but Tommy saw it as proof that the app was real, that I was going to stab him. He rushed into his closet, packed up a suitcase of clothes, and told me that he'd stay at Spencer's until the app told him that it was safe to come back. I felt like screaming at him. How could he be so gullible? No technology had the power to predict the future. Couldn't argue with him, though, because, well, he was already gone. Besides, I had to deal with my work emergency. I went to my office, and I spent the next few hours redoing all the work that I had done for the last month. It was so frustrating, but I was able to finish as much as I could. My boss still didn't know what caused us to lose all that data, but he promised me it wouldn't happen again. When I got back home, I was exhausted and angry. Tommy still wasn't back yet. I was alone, and I didn't know what to do with myself. I tried watching TV, but I kept thinking about that stupid app. I knew it wasn't real, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. So, eventually, I pulled out my phone and I went to the App Store to see if I could download it. I remembered the app's name and I found it right away. It was available to download for free, so I did. As it was loading, I saw that it was released yesterday. Didn't have any reviews yet, and the publisher was unlisted. And that's when I realized what had really happened. This app was a joke after all. It was created by Spencer, Tommy's brother. Spencer was a computer genius with way too much time on his hands. He created this app to mess with his brother. I guess Black Mirror had inspired him. The app probably wasn't even connected to an AI engine. Spencer was probably typing the answers himself. Which means that he also sabotaged my work, using his computer skills to delete a bunch of files just so he could prove that the app could predict the future. I had wasted all day at work because of a prank. It was insane and way too complicated. I had to figure out how to get back at him. I got a message on my phone saying that the app failed to download. I guess it was just made for Tommy. I got in my car and I drove straight to Spencer's house. I parked across the street so that he wouldn't see me, and then I snuck around to the side of the building. I could see Spencer and Tommy through the window. They were sitting together, talking about me. Tommy still seemed freaked out, and Spencer was trying to calm him down. He could barely hide his smirk. Very quietly, I walked to the next window, the one outside Spencer's office. When I looked inside, I saw his computer still running. I pushed the window open and crawled inside. Thankfully, Spencer had stupidly kept his screen on. I didn't know a lot about coding, but I could tell that he was still connected to his fake app. As I thought, no AI was involved. It was basically just a fancy-looking chat service where a user would type in a time, and then Spencer could manually type in a reply. That was it. That was how he could predict the future. I got onto his computer and started typing. I assumed that the message would pop up on Tommy's phone. I wrote, "Your future has changed. Now you will be attacked by your brother. He's in the room with you right now. Do not tell him that you suspect anything." Then I sent the message. I could hear Tommy's phone ding from the other room, and then I waited. I expected to hear Tommy freak out and run out of the house. I didn't expect to hear all the screaming and banging sounds. I opened the door to look into the living room, and I saw Tommy standing over his brother's body. He had a broken lamp in his hands. He had used it to hit Spencer on the head. This had gone way too far. I ran into the room and screamed for Tommy to stop. "What are you doing here?" he asked. I didn't answer. I didn't know what to say. I just stared at Spencer's body, twitching on the ground. He was going to kill me, Tommy explained, tears leaking from his eyes. I told him to put the lamp down. I tried to explain about the app, but he wouldn't believe me. I told him to look on Spencer's computer and see for himself. His face completely blank, he dropped the lamp and walked into Spencer's office. He was there for a while, probably looking at the computer screen. That gave me some time to call an ambulance for Spencer. I went into the office to find Tommy, but he wasn't there. The window was still open, and it looked like he'd made a run for it. I went back to Spencer, who was barely conscious and bleeding out of his ears. Together, we waited for the ambulance to arrive. I went with Spencer to the hospital, where the police were waiting for me. I told them all about the app, about how it was a prank that went horribly wrong. I said that Spencer would corroborate my story once he got out of the emergency room. Unfortunately, he never did. He slipped into a coma and is still unconscious. It's been 3 days, and no one knows where Tommy went. I hope that Spencer wakes up. I hope that Tommy will reappear somewhere. But for now, I have no idea what to do with myself. I feel so guilty about how things turned out.
My name is Ethan, and I work for a car rental company in Nebraska. It's an okay job, but I'm always dealing with angry customers. I haven't had a vacation in years, but this January, I finally had enough PTO saved up to take a 2-week trip to California. My girlfriend Roxanne and I rented a really nice beach house. Because it was the off-season, it wasn't too expensive. Our first day there was pretty relaxing. I went to a nice restaurant and watched the sunset over the ocean. Then we went back to our place and drank some wine. The next morning, Roxanne slept in while I took a run on the beach. It was still pretty early, so no one was out yet. I got pretty far down the beach before I finally saw someone up ahead. It was a woman around my age, late 20s, with the same red hair as Roxanne. I was about to run past her when she raced toward me. I could tell she was panicking and crying. I pulled out my headphones and asked her what was wrong. "Is your name Ethan?" she asked. I studied her face, trying to see if I knew her from somewhere. She didn't look familiar, but she had similar features to my girlfriend, so I assumed that she might have been one of Roxanne's cousins or something. I told her that my name was Ethan, and then she wrapped me in a big hug. She wouldn't let me go for a long time. I had to politely push her away. "Who are you?" I asked. "You're going to think I'm crazy," she said, "but I promise you I'm not." Then she took a deep breath and told me that she was my daughter. I was so shocked, I laughed out loud. I knew I didn't have a daughter. Even if I did, this woman was much too old to be mine. She had to be mistaken, or maybe she was scamming me. I told her that she had the wrong person and started to back away, but she grabbed my wrist and held me in place. She looked really desperate. She begged for me to hear her out. And then she explained that her name was Madison. She was from 30 years in the future and she'd traveled back in time to save me. I didn't believe her, of course. Time travel was impossible. But she made me look into her eyes and see that she had the exact same eye color as Roxanne. Besides that, Madison was the name Roxanne and I both liked. It made sense that we'd choose that name for our daughter. I thought about what she had told me. She said that she came back to save me. I asked what she meant by that, and she said that her mom was going to kill me tonight. Before she could go into any details, her eyes widened and she froze. Without saying anything else, she ran off. I felt a hand on my shoulder and spun around to see that Roxanne was right behind me. That was why Madison had to run off. Roxanne didn't get a good look at the woman, so she asked me who it was, and I decided not to tell her the truth. Either Madison was lying and Roxanne would think I was crazy for believing her, or Madison was telling the truth and Roxanne was planning to murder me. Roxanne raised an eyebrow. She could tell that I was hiding something from her, but then she dropped it and told me to walk back with her to the beach house. When we got back inside, I saw that Roxanne had already made breakfast. There was a huge spread of pancakes, eggs, and even some smoothies on the table. Roxanne never cooked at home, so it seemed really uncharacteristic of her. We sat down, and Roxanne just stared at me from across the table until I started eating. I got a very weird vibe. I wished I'd had more time to talk to Madison. She could have told me how Roxanne was planning to kill me. I still didn't believe her story, but I was getting really paranoid. I was starting to wonder if maybe there was poison in my food. "Well?" Roxanne asked. "Are you going to start?" I had no idea how to respond, so I grabbed my fork and just started eating the pancake. It tasted delicious. If it had been poisoned, I definitely couldn't tell. I continued eating, but Roxanne still hadn't taken a bite. She was just staring at me. I was halfway done with my breakfast, and she still hadn't eaten anything. All I could think about was that the idea that my food had been poisoned. She asked me if I liked the meal, and I said yes. She tried to get me to finish everything, but I told her I was done and ran off to the bathroom. Just in case, I forced myself to throw up everything I'd eaten. I knew that it was stupid to be so suspicious of my girlfriend because of some made-up story, but I didn't want to risk it. When we got back out, Roxanne had cleaned up the table. I asked her if she'd eaten any of her own food, and she said, "A bit." I couldn't tell if she was lying. After that, we went out to the balcony overlooking the ocean. Roxanne leaned against the edge and invited me to stand with her. I slowly approached, but I kept imagining her pushing me over the edge. Maybe that was how she'd kill me. She kept encouraging me to stand close to her. I tried to act casual, but she could sense that I was on edge. She asked me what was wrong. I responded with the question, "Do you still love me?" She laughed and said yes. I looked into her eyes and believed her. For the rest of the day, I forced myself to forget about Madison. She was just some crazy person who had done some research on me and then made up that time travel story as some sort of sick joke. That had to be it. The fact that she looked so much like my girlfriend was just a coincidence. For the rest of the night, I was still on edge, but I forced myself to stop being paranoid. Roxanne and I went to bed pretty early, but I woke up in the middle of the night. I went downstairs to get a drink when I noticed a note on the floor. Someone had slid it from under the front door. It said, "Get out, now." I knew that Madison had left it for me. All my fear and paranoia came back at that moment. I knew it was irrational, but I needed to get out of there. If Roxanne was going to kill me that night, then I'd stay away until the morning. I quietly grabbed my keys, got in my car, and drove to the other end of the beach. I spent the rest of the night walking around alone, trying to sort through my thoughts. Once the sun came up, I drove back to the house. When I got back inside, everything was very silent. At first, I thought that Roxanne was still asleep, but when I went up to the bedroom, I saw her lying dead in a pool of blood. Someone had come in during the night and killed her while I was gone. I called the police and spent the next few hours trying to explain what had happened. They didn't believe my time travel story, but I could tell that they also didn't think I was the killer. I was so shocked that I couldn't stop crying. One of the officers just kept asking me questions. After I described Madison for the third time, the officer pulled out her phone and showed me a picture. "Is this the person that you saw?" she asked. I couldn't believe it. She had Madison's picture on the screen. "Yes," I said. "That's my future daughter." "That's not your daughter, you fool," the cop said. "That's Roxanne's sister. She's been locked up for 3 years after attempting to murder Roxanne." Roxanne never told me that she had a sister, but now everything made sense. Of course this woman would look like Roxanne. She wasn't a time traveler. She just made up that story so she could trick me into leaving my girlfriend alone. Roxanne died because I had believed her ridiculous story. The police promised that they'd track her down, but they still haven't found her. I miss Roxanne every day, and I feel terrible that my own paranoia had indirectly allowed her to be murdered.
Everything started to go downhill on the 5th day, when Cindy called Raphael a greedy bastard because he ate more portions than the rest of us. "It was freezing cold outside," she said as part of her rant, "in the middle of winter, and none of us boys would brave the cold for supplies." She maintained that she had watched Raphael take more beer and food than the rest of us, and she'd had enough of it because it meant that the rest of us would starve when we ran out of supplies. It was not the will to drive out that was the problem. It was the fact that we could not, I reasoned from what she said. The snow on the path from our winter vacation abode to the nearest store was at least knee-deep. It was too much work, and we had calculated all of the heavy snowfall in our shopping. What we had not calculated was Raphael's heavy appetite. It was a moment of outburst that I had particularly noted because of the marked change in Raphael's demeanor when those words had been uttered. He had been quiet at first in reaction to it, and then his eyes had fallen to a squint of consideration to manage his seething rage. His arms twitched as anger still managed, though. He sighed and examined the portion of food he was being insulted over. He heaved to exhale, and the mist of the winter cold escaped his nostrils. I sensed something had changed when Raphael dropped the plate onto the table and turned to Carl, who held Cindy in his arms, his new girlfriend, whom he had insisted come with us boys to the vacation home against our better judgment. "Is this what you think of me, Carl?" Raphael asked with a look of puzzlement on his face. Then he turned to me. "Doug?" Carl sighed and leaned into his girlfriend. He stared at her face and shrugged. "He's had 4 bottles of beer, and it's barely noon. We have had none." Cindy's smart mouth let off. Anybody who wants some more beer? Pick the keys and brave the cold to go get beers. Cindy. I had had enough of the awful way she spoke to Raphael. The tension in the atmosphere was understandable, and I was slightly offended by the silence Carl maintained when his girlfriend went off on Raphael like that. Suddenly, Raphael grinned and stood up from where he sat. He stared at all three of us, Carl, me, and Cindy, and spoke without missing a beat. Maybe there are too many of us and too little resources. It'd be a shame if some of us had to leave, he said cryptically. And with that, he left us in the living room and ambled around the cabin to his room. I did not see Raphael for the rest of the day, and I did not check in on him as I had no idea of the evil that had reared its head and now brewed over our small group. It was not until late in the night, when I was cozying up in the warmth of the thick blanket for the winter, that the strange noise woke me up. The cry was desperate and pleading, and it had penetrated so deep into my dreams that when I woke up, I spent a few seconds investigating whether it had been imagined or real. It wasn't long before I clocked out the source of the cry and the familiar voices behind it. The hairs on my skin stood on edge. I rushed off my bed and scrimmaged through my door towards Carl and Cindy's room. "Please! Ah! My fucking arm!" Carl cried in a grave tone that turned my stomach. "You've chopped my arms off, you bastard!" The crying grew louder and more desperate as I approached the room, and my haste faltered to a slow, careful march towards the door. Wild chomping sounds followed the closer I got, and I flinched at how violent it sounded. Carl's cry horrified me because it spoke of death. Between the cold from the winter and the cold from sheer panic, I could not tell which paralyzed me the most. My mind turned to Raphael. He had to be in his own room, too. My head spun. What was happening? The question in my head was a difficult one to answer. Was there an intruder in the house? A murderous intruder? How could an intruder have found us in the middle of winter? What did the intruder want? A piece of my mind instinctively cried for escape, but my legs were too heavy to carry me through, and the cold outside would kill me quicker than any murderer could. I had only one thought in my head, and it was to return to fetch my pistol. I hurried back to my room as stealthily as I could, and Carl's screams faded the farther I got, until all was quiet. I retrieved my gun and stepped outside my door, ready to defend myself and Raphael, if he was still alive, from whatever murderous spree whoever was in the house was on. To my utmost horror, it was Raphael who was on the other side of the passageway, dripping in blood, with a bloody pickaxe in one hand. He looked at me with a wicked grin on his face and turned towards me. "Well, I did say there were too many of us and too little resources," he shrugged whimsically. Shame it had to be them. Raphael's audacity stunned me. I had been friends with him for 3 years, and I had no idea he had it in him to butcher his friends in cold blood and show a total lack of remorse about it. He maintained cold indifference to what he had done, and perhaps it was that which terrified me the most. I wanted nothing more in the world than for what I had just witnessed to be a horrible dream that I woke up from afterwards with a feverish sweat, but it was not. "Do you have a problem with my rations?" Raphael asked me, slowly making his way towards me as the blood dripped from the tip of the pickaxe to the floor. The world around me blurred, and my mind was dizzy from having to process how much danger I was in. My fingers on the trigger shook as I reached the decision when Raphael's demeanor turned from casual to menacing. "Ah!" He roared as he approached me to finish me off, just as he had done to Carl and Cindy. I pulled out the weapon I had on me and watched his eyes light up in fright when he faced death himself. My gun banged, and it caught him straight to the forehead. The pickaxe dropped from his hands and banged on the floor, just as Raphael's limp body did. The house was suddenly quiet, and my horror ended with my heart thrashing wildly in my chest. I rushed towards the room where Cindy and Carl stayed, witnessing a bloody mess that burned my stomach. I fell to my knees and cried when I realized how futile calling emergency services would be, as it would be meaningless to drive the cold night through a heap of snow to clean up already dead bodies.
I worked for a tech startup outside San Francisco. I didn't make a lot of money, but my boss assured me that once the company unveiled its new products, my salary would triple. I've been there for 3 years, and they still kept telling me that the product launch was coming soon. I was starting to feel like they were just stringing me along. I didn't quit though, because I needed the paycheck. Plus, I was able to work from home, which was really important for me. My older sister Elizabeth was paralyzed from the neck down, so I had to be her caregiver when her nurse wasn't there. Elizabeth demanded constant attention, and her nurses never stayed with us longer than a few months. She was an extremely difficult patient, always shouting at her nurses and taking out all her frustrations on them. She was even worse to me. Sometimes I wished that she'd just die, but then I felt really guilty for the thought. One morning, I was spoon-feeding her breakfast when my boss Antonio texted me about a mandatory meeting. I cleaned up Elizabeth's face and then rushed over to my laptop. I expected the entire staff to be there, but it was just Antonio and me. He was the kind of person who never smiled, but that morning, he had a massive grin on his face. He told me that their product launch was finally going to happen. Just 1 month away, I knew this was amazing news, because that meant I'd finally have enough money to afford better full-time care for my sister. Antonio explained that there was still one more hurdle that we had to deal with. The product had only been tested in-house, so they needed one more trial from someone outside of the office, someone who would represent the average customer. Because I just worked in marketing, I had no contact with the development team. That made me the ideal candidate to test out the product. I tried to ask him what it actually did. After all, I'd worked for this company for years and I still wasn't told what they were developing. He refused to answer. He said that the whole point of this trial was that an outsider would be able to use their product without any negative effects. I really didn't have a choice. I wanted the company to succeed. I wanted the raise. So, I agreed. That afternoon, a small package arrived at my front door. Elizabeth was screaming at me at the time, so I almost didn't hear the doorbell. I rushed to get it and then opened it right away. Elizabeth demanded to know what I'd gotten, but I didn't want to tell her. Part of the trial was that I was sworn to secrecy, even with my sister. This made her mad. She screamed so loudly that I had to go outside for some peace and quiet. Sitting on my front stoop, I looked over the device, a small square with about 20 buttons. It looked extremely generic, like an old calculator. It came with a one-page manual. I guessed it was some kind of handheld projector, something to do with holograms. But when I read over the manual, I realized that it was something much, much better. The manual explained that the device was for memory tourism. By punching in the right code, I could be sent back to any point in my conscious life, which meant as far back as 5 years old. The experience would last for 3 minutes at a time. I quickly scanned over the warnings, none of which seemed all that important, and then I decided to do my first test. I typed in the date of my college graduation. I pressed the right buttons, and then waited. Nothing happened for about 5 seconds, and then my surroundings instantly disappeared. I was now back at my old school, surrounded by former classmates. It felt so real. I could feel the graduation robe hanging loosely over my body. I felt younger too, healthier. The constant headache that I'd had since I started taking care of Elizabeth full-time had completely disappeared. It was wonderful. I heard the dean call out my name, and I proudly walked onto the stage. I remember tripping over my robes on the way up the stairs, so I tried to walk slowly. Thankfully, I didn't trip. I received my diploma and then looked out into the audience. I could see my parents and sister in the front row, but they weren't looking at me. Elizabeth was throwing another tantrum, and both my parents were trying to calm her down. They'd missed my big moment. I'd forgotten about that part. Everything faded away, and I was back to the present. I couldn't believe it. I just experienced the past exactly as it had happened. Then I realized it wasn't exactly the same. In real life, I had tripped, but in this memory, I stopped myself from tripping. I was able to change one little part. I looked down at the manual one more time. The very last warning at the bottom of the page said, "Do not change any of your past actions." Did that mean that I could literally change the past? Was it a memory machine or an actual time machine? I had to find out. I ran back inside. The living room was an absolute mess. In Elizabeth's latest fit, she'd managed to ram her motorized wheelchair into the table, knocking my laptop and all my papers onto the floor. "Now will you tell me what you got?" she asked. I didn't have time to be mad at her. I had to ask. "Did I trip during my graduation?" "What?" I asked her again. "When I was on stage getting my diploma, did I trip?" She refused to answer. She thought I was making fun of her for being in a wheelchair. It didn't matter. I cleaned up her mess and set my laptop aside, hoping that it wasn't completely broken. Then I raced into my bedroom to try the device again. I figured I could do an easy experiment to find out. I set the device to 2 weeks ago when I'd gone to the salon. Instantly, I was taken back to the hairdresser's chair. The woman asked me what I wanted, and I told her that I'd like to get red highlights. She tried to talk me out of it, but I insisted. This lasted for the whole 3 minutes. Then I was back in my bedroom. I looked in the mirror and saw that my hair now had red highlights. So it worked. I had actually changed the past after all. This machine was going to change the world. And I know exactly what I was going to do with it. The manual advised against traveling to any time before you were 5 years old, because memories aren't fully formed before that age. But I had to risk it. I had to go back to when I was 4, when Elizabeth had her paralyzing accident. I started the device, sending myself back to Elizabeth's 6th birthday party. We were near my uncle's empty pool. Elizabeth had wanted to impress me by jumping off the diving board and landing on an inflatable raft. That was how she became paralyzed. The horrible moment was seared into my memory. Just as I'd remembered, Elizabeth and I were racing toward the diving board. None of the adults were paying attention. But then, something strange happened. I stepped onto the diving board instead of Elizabeth. "Get off there!" she screamed. "I told you it wasn't safe." "I'll be fine," I told her. The words just came out of my mouth. I could feel the board creak under my feet. "No!" Elizabeth screamed. She ran toward me, trying to pull me off the board. She wrapped her arm around me, pulling me back, but in the process, she slipped off the edge and fell into the pool. I looked down and saw her lying there, her neck twisted to the side. That was when the memory ended. I was back in the present, struggling to catch my breath. Nothing made sense. Elizabeth chose to jump. That was how she hurt herself. She was showing off. It wasn't because she was trying to save me. Or was it? I started to cry. All this time I thought that my sister had caused the accident herself, but I had misremembered the whole time. She was paralyzed because of me, because she was trying to save me. I was too numb to move. Slowly, my bedroom door creaked open and Elizabeth powered her wheelchair into my room. She saw me sobbing on my bed. "I'm sorry about your computer," she said. "I didn't mean to break it." I looked up at her and asked, "What do you remember about your accident?" She didn't answer for a while. Then she said, "Nothing. It's all a blur. All I know is that I shouldn't have gone near that pool." I could tell that she was lying to me. She knew that she'd fallen because she was trying to save me. All this time, she never told me the truth. Elizabeth noticed the look on my face. "You remember it now, don't you?" Did that machine help you remember? Why didn't you tell me? I was glad you blocked out the memory, she said. When you were a kid, you were always so wild and reckless. I was so worried that you would hurt yourself. If I hadn't been there. I can fix it, I said. Before she could say anything else, I turned the device back on and went back to the past. Once again, Elizabeth and I were running toward the empty swimming pool. This time, I forced myself to skid to a halt. Let's go back to the party, I said. Elizabeth looked surprised. You're sure? Yes, I said. It's dangerous. I know that now. And together, we walked back toward the adults. No one was getting hurt today. I was able to spend 2 precious moments enjoying my childhood once more before everything turned black. When I was in the present, I was no longer in my bedroom. Everything looked different. I tried to look around the room, but I couldn't move my head. I couldn't move anything. Something was very wrong. Help! I screamed. Elizabeth walked in. She was no longer in a wheelchair. I was. She looked at me, annoyed. What is it this time? Do I need to clean you again?
I believe my fascination of gore films stemmed from seeing my pet cat being run over when I was 10 years old. I couldn't get the image out of my mind, and for some twisted psychological reason, I coped by seeking out more blood. At least fictional ones that came with almost no real-life consequence. I don't think that I could stomach anything real, but zombie movies when they would rip out people's arms and eat them? That sounds enjoyable. I'm 18 now, and I realize that perhaps some of these movies weren't so fictional after all, and perhaps there was more to them aside from just being movies. See, to channel my interest, I started an anonymous Instagram account, a Finsta, where I did nothing but review quite extreme gore horror films. Of course, I wasn't getting anything out of it beyond satisfying my own personal curiosities. But one day, a girl DM'd me. A pretty girl. And right off the bat, we connected. Yeah, that's right. I couldn't believe it myself. I mean, finding someone who's into the same thing I am is hard enough. But finding a girl that's also into it? I thought I won the lottery. I wasn't going to be stupid about it. I checked her profile and saw that Anna was mostly your next-door girl. But boy, was she hot. And she was really into all these crazy gore horror films. We spent the next few weeks bonding, talking about all sorts of crazy films, and then those conversations made way for just how crazy life was. And then, if it all wasn't crazy enough, after a month of talking, we both realized that we actually lived in the same city. Anna Boyle had gone to East High, while I went to West High. What a coincidence. To be honest, I was already thinking about gathering the courage to ask her for a night out. A movie downtown would be nice. And like classic Anna, that always seemed to be reading my mind. She invited me to a screening of a gore horror movie. I didn't know we had those around. Anna told me it was an underground cinema, a monthly screening ran by a group of passionate archivists who found a rare restored copy of Hamster 2. I was definitely not going to turn down that offer. Hamster 2 was a rare gem. The day of the screening came, and I found myself starting out at an abandoned Victorian home, an old haunted house attraction, the apparent site of the upcoming screening. The main entrance was padlocked shut, but I tried anyway. As expected, it didn't budge. Guess I must have been early. Hey, Chris! I heard a girl call out. It had to be Anna. She was calling me from somewhere? Down here! I saw her now all too familiar pretty face peeking out from the basement window. Anna, hey! She smiled, and explained that the entrance was out back, down a cellar door, then straight down the corridor. Fair enough. In hindsight, I couldn't understand how I could be so stupid. Walked right into a trap. Because of what? A pretty girl? The cellar was actually pretty clean and well lit, which is why I didn't suspect anything. It looked like your typical back entrance, until I got inside, and everything went dark. I woke up, feeling a sharp tingling pain on the back of my head, and then I realized that I was tied up to a chair, hands and feet bound tightly by chain cuffs. In front of me was a camera, and all around me were monitors showing a live view of me squirming in a chair. Mirror images of me scared shitless stared back in horror. Anna stood in front of me with a chainsaw. "Anna?" I asked in a panic. What is all this?" "Well, we're watching a movie," said an unknown man's voice behind me. "I mean, I told you we were watching a restored version of Hamster 2. This is exactly it," Anna said, with a big smile plastered across her face. And suddenly, a round of applause from behind me. A whole crowd was seated back there. I could feel them. I could hear them laughing and jeering. They were enjoying themselves as they watched me about to get cut up, both live and on screen. I was the afternoon showing. "Anna, you're doing this for a movie?" I asked her out of nowhere. I thought that if I was going to die, I at least deserved to know why. Why was I being punished for my own morbid curiosity? There were other gore movie fans out there, and they didn't get invited to this. What is this? Some kind of satanic cult that loves gore movies? I'd like to at least know that my otherwise boring 18 years of existence actually meant something at the end. That it won't end up as nothing but a pile of blood and guts like my cat. Basically, nothing but useless matter. Trash. Decaying rot flesh trash. Because, Christian, we like movies. And like you said so yourself, no one else likes movies like we do. So we're here to offer you a deal. A deal? Yes. You see, we worship the movie, an entity that exists beyond the constraints of celluloid and camera lenses, greater than all the space and time and all universes, but ones whose glimpses of we catch only through the garish depiction of blood and guts projected on screen. Huh? I thought that they must be joking, but no. The people behind me were cheering and clapping, and Anna continued her piece. So today, if you choose, can be your initiation day into our little movie club. And all you have to do is give up a limb, a finger, a thumb, an arm. The bigger the appendage, the more respect you will get. And should you choose not to join the movie club, then we'll finish you here. Chop you up bit by bit to appease the movie, so we can get another glimpse of her, and hopefully have her bestow her presence upon us. The crowd howled. I looked at Anna helplessly and knew that I only had one way out of my situation. Chop off my... I don't need it anymore. It's only brought me trouble so far. The crowd went wild. I went home that night content with the fact that although I will remain forever a virgin, at least I had suddenly gained a whole group of people who were into extreme gore films. A whole room of people that were into my interests that met up every full moon to watch movies. The whole film god thing. I'm not sure how serious they were about that, but on my third meeting with them, when someone did choose to get chopped up for the movie. I could have sworn that in between the recorded blood and guts, I saw a menacing eye. Bigger than me, bigger than life itself, bigger than the whole universe, carefully watching us and our cruelties for some unknown cause.
My name is Jessica. I always thought I would be some big success, until I got laid off from my high-paying IT job and was forced to work minimum wage at my sister's shop. My old job accused me of stealing from them, which was totally not true. But they did everything they could to label me a liar and badmouth me to every other business in the city. I was blacklisted as a thief by every employer in town, so I had to ask my sister for help. Joan was 2 years younger than me, and she owned a boutique clothing shop near the university campus. Growing up, no one ever expected Joan to be the successful one. I was the sister who got good grades and worked all the time and had big plans for the future. Joan, meanwhile, was a party girl. The fact that I now had to work for her was really tough for me to accept, especially after how unfairly I was when I got fired from my old job. To make matters worse, Joan was a terrible boss. She paid me barely enough to live on and forced me to take extra shifts whenever her other employees called in sick. I worked with a bunch of idiot teenagers, so they called in sick a lot. I needed money, so of course I took on as many shifts as I could, but it really felt like I was working all the time for very little pay. One weekend, I was planning to go on a blind date with a guy named Jim. This was my first date in months, and I was really looking forward to it. But as I was getting ready, Joan called me to say that I had to come into work for the night shift. Her shop usually closed at 9, but whenever we had football games at the nearby campus, she extended the hours until 1 in the morning. She thought she'd got more foot traffic from drunk college students who might want to buy something, but it almost never worked out that way. Usually, I'd just be alone in the shop waiting for customers who never came. I tried to tell her no. This date meant a lot to me and I didn't want to cancel on him. Besides, she had a couple other employees who needed the hours. Joan didn't care. She told me that if I didn't come into work, she'd cut my hours way back and give my extra shifts to her better employees. She literally said that. Better employees. Like I was some kind of slacker for wanting a night off. Without any other option, I told her I'd work the night shift. Then I texted Jim with a very long apology explaining my situation. We'd only communicated by text before, so I thought it would be a little awkward to call him up just to cancel on him. He texted me a one-word response. Okay. That night, I showed up at Joan's store and told my coworker Michael that he could leave. He looked at me, obviously grateful that I was doing the night shift instead of him, and then hurried off. For the next hour, I stood at the counter and waited for customers to come in. No one did. I was bored and angry. I scrolled through my phone and saw photos on Instagram of Joan dancing at some club. She looked like she was having the time of her life. Another hour passed and I still didn't have any customers. I wondered if I could just close up shop early and hope that Joan wouldn't check the security cameras. But I didn't want to risk it. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a man's voice say, "Hello, Jessica." I practically jumped out of my skin. Someone had walked inside without me noticing, and now he was standing right behind me. I spun around and ended up face to face with Jim, the guy I had to cancel on. "What are you doing here?" I asked. He wasn't as handsome as his pictures, but I could tell it was the same guy. He leaned pretty close to me, smirking, and said, "I wanted to surprise you." "Well, you definitely did." I backed away from him. The way he just appeared like that, it was a little weird. "I'm sorry about canceling, but as you can see, I'm on the clock." "This is where you work," he said. "Nice place." "Uh-huh," I muttered. He kept wandering around the store, sliding his fingertips over all the hanging shirts and dresses. I really wanted him to leave. He was freaking me out. He walked to the front door, and for a second, it looked like he was going to walk away. But instead, he clicked the deadbolt shut, locking us both inside. Then he turned back toward me. You shouldn't have canceled on me." I apologized again, but he just glared. "I bought you flowers," he shouted. "I made reservations. I shaved." He charged right at me, pure anger in his eyes. "And you texted me to cancel? You didn't even care enough to call?" I looked around. The only exit was in the front. There weren't even any windows for me to climb out. There was a bathroom in the back, so maybe I would run in there and lock myself in. Or I could fight him off. He dove over the counter and reached for me. His fingers tore at my shirt, but I was able to jump back before he could grab me. I ran toward the door, but before I could unlatch the deadbolt, he reached me again. This time, he grabbed my hair and pulled hard. I felt my body fly backwards, right on top of one of the displays. Wood creaked below me as the display shattered under my weight and dropped me to the floor. Pain shot through my back as I landed on some kind of box hidden under the display. As Jim lumbered closer, I looked down at the box I'd landed on. It was a microwave-sized metal safe. Normally, it would be too heavy for me to pick up easily, but I was running on adrenaline. Plus, it was the only real weapon I had. Just as Jim reached me, I picked up the safe and smashed it into his face. Just one strike. He instantly fell to the ground, unconscious. As Jim lay bleeding on the ground, I looked down at the safe in my hands, grateful that it saved my life. That's when I noticed a logo on the bottom of the safe. It was the same logo as my old company. It took me a second to put all the pieces together until I realized. Joan had stole from my old job and blamed me for it. That's how I got fired. That's how she was able to afford her own business. My life was miserable and hers was fantastic because she'd blame me for a crime she'd done. And I never would have found out if this psycho hadn't come after me. I called 911 and told them to come over. They'd see what happened on the security tape, and they'd also find the stolen safe that I'd used as a weapon. Thank God I'd been forced into working the night shift. That one crazy night changed my life forever. My wife Trisha was the CEO of a small but growing tech company. I was just a teacher. We had a very happy marriage, and it didn't bother me that Trisha was the breadwinner of the house. She was always stressed out though, and she put a lot of pressure on herself to keep expanding her company. Last quarter, her company had their biggest profits yet. They just acquired another small company, which was a difficult but very lucrative deal for them. At her shareholders meeting, Trisha was able to give the good news to her investors. Afterward, she came home in very good spirits, so I decided to take her out to dinner to celebrate. Even though I didn't like fancy restaurants, I knew that Trisha did. So I ended up taking her to a French restaurant that I'd heard great things about. We sat at a table in the back and ordered. Before the food came, Trisha told me all about her day. She really was an amazing woman, and I was so happy that her company was doing well. Throughout the meal though, I noticed that one of the waiters kept staring at us from the other side of the restaurant. I didn't say anything at first, but after a while, it started to creep me out. I interrupted Trisha and told her to look to her left. By the time she glanced over, the waiter was already gone. I didn't think much about the waiter after that. We ended up having a really nice, pleasant dinner. I tried to pay, but Trisha wouldn't let me. We thanked our waiter and headed out. When we got into the parking lot, Trisha shouted, "What the hell?" I didn't know what she was looking at. She started running toward our car. That's when I saw what she'd seen. Our tires had been slashed. Right away, I thought about the waiter who had stared at us. I knew there was something strange about him. I didn't have proof, but I figured he was the one who slashed our tires. I explained that to Trisha and she seemed pretty scared. She asked me to describe the man. I told her that he was balding and tall, with a red goatee. "Oh my God," she said. She knew this person. She didn't tell me who it was though. She just told me to call a tow truck. "Shouldn't I call 911 first?" I asked. "No!" she screamed. I tried to get her to explain who this guy was, but she wouldn't. Eventually, the tow truck came and replaced our tires. Then we went back home. Trisha and I had just moved into a new house. She'd bought it right after her company made its big acquisition. It was a lot nicer and bigger than we needed, especially because we weren't planning to have kids. But it was a great place, very secluded. When we got inside, Trisha locked the door. I could tell she was still freaked out about the vandalism, but she still wouldn't tell me what was going on. We ended up going to sleep early. I had nightmares the whole night. The next day, Trisha went to our office as usual. I stayed at home. My students were on spring break. I did my regular house chores, still thinking about that man with the red goatee. I went out to grab the mail, but when I opened our mailbox, there was a dead bird inside. It had a pocket knife sticking out of its stomach. Someone had put it there. I went back inside and called Trisha. When I told her what I'd seen, she got really quiet on the phone. Then I begged her to tell me who was after her. She took a deep breath and finally explained everything. She said that the company they'd acquired last quarter didn't want to sell. It was a hostile takeover, and the man was one of its owners. He hated losing his company, and now he was after her. I felt terrible. All Trisha wanted to do was grow her company. She was the hardest worker I knew, and it wasn't fair that stupid business stuff would lead to stalking and harassment. Still, I had to be prepared in case he came back. I told Trisha that I was going to call the police, and once again, she screamed, "No!" I could tell there was something she wasn't telling me, but I trusted her enough not to argue. I ended the call and then walked around the house, making sure all the doors and windows were locked. Nothing happened for the next few days. Trisha and I didn't even talk about it. We just pretended that life was back to normal. Then, Friday came around. Trisha was at her office as usual, and I'd just gotten home from the farmer's market. I walked inside and unloaded all my groceries. I put everything in the fridge, not really paying attention to what I was doing. But when I closed the fridge, I saw that someone had defaced all our photos. Trisha's face was scratched off each one. Somehow, the stalker had gotten inside the house. I ran to the table where I'd left my phone, but before I could reach it, the bearded man jumped out of a closet and grabbed me. He had the craziest look in his eyes. "Please," I said, too scared to fight back. "Don't hurt me!" He shoved me hard. I fell backwards, slamming into the kitchen island and then collapsing onto the ground. As I tried to stand, the man kicked me in the face. I felt one of my teeth loosen. I looked up, blood oozing from my mouth, and I saw the man loom over me. He pulled out a knife. What do you want?" I whimpered. "Blood," he said. "You and your wife are monsters." "We didn't do anything." "Really?" he roared. He explained that he and his brother had started that company 10 years ago. Trisha tried to buy it off them, but they refused. Their business was very successful, and they loved what they did. So, Trisha sabotaged some of their products, paid people to intimidate their staff, and slander them online. She created so much drama that the men were forced to sell their company for peanuts. "She wouldn't do that," I protested. "I knew my wife. She was a good person." "But I'm not done!" he screamed, keeping the knife close enough to my face that I was scared to move. "After she took our company and swindled us out of millions, she bribed the government to foreclose on my brother's house. And then she bought it." He was talking about the house we were in right now. "My brother had a heart attack soon after," he continued. "All the stress that your wife gave him was just too much. And when I saw you in the restaurant, laughing and eating a $300 meal, I knew I had to do something." His expression was unhinged, but somehow I believed him. Trisha was an amazing wife, but I guess she was a monster at work. All our success was built on the terrible things she did. That would explain why she never wanted me to call the police. He raised the knife, ready to strike. "Any last words?" he said. "I'm sorry," I said. Instantly, his grip on the knife loosened. He could see in my eyes that I had nothing to do with the tragedies in his life. It was all Trisha. He reached down. For a second, I thought he was going to strangle me, but instead, he grabbed my arm and helped me stand. My mouth was throbbing, but I was no longer dripping in blood. "Will you help me?" he asked. "With what?" "Revenge." I thought about it for a long time. I I could never do anything to hurt Trisha. But if everything this man said was true, then she needed to pay for what she did. No, I said. I won't help you, but I won't get in your way either. He smiled at my answer. Then he turned around and walked out of the house. After that, I went to the dentist for emergency surgery. It wasn't that bad. And when I got home, I waited for Trisha to arrive. I was going to tell her everything, including my deal with her stalker. She never came home. The police found her car in the office basement, but Trisha was never seen again. Her company went on without her. I ended up selling the house and moved into a smaller, cheaper place. I didn't know what happened to that bearded man, but I hope he stays away from me forever.
Last year, I visited my parents at their new place. They had moved into a gated retirement community outside San Diego, and they were really excited to show me. Both my parents had always been very active, so I knew that living in a community like that would be a great fit for them. They had a community center, a pool, and weekly events. My mom even volunteered to lead the HOA. As part of her position, she patrolled the neighborhood and looked for any areas of improvement in the houses. As a former real estate agent, that seemed like a fun activity for her. So I flew into the San Diego airport and took a rental car to their community. Right away, I could tell it was a nice, welcoming place. I was able to stay there as a guest for 1 week maximum, which was totally fine with me. Mom showed me around the neighborhood, while Dad stayed behind to get the guest room ready. We met a couple of their neighbors, who all introduced themselves. I guess my mom talked about me a lot because they seemed to know everything about my life. They all seemed so nice, acting like my parents were their best friends. The next morning, I sat with my parents on their porch drinking my morning coffee. I asked them about our plans for the day, but Dad said that they both had to leave. His old coworker had an accident the night before, and they needed to go and see him in the hospital. They'd stay the night and then come back the next day. I was disappointed, of course. I'd traveled all this way to spend time with my parents, and they were leaving me behind for a whole day. But I didn't argue. I understood the situation. Besides, I hadn't been to San Diego in years, so I figured I could drive around and spend all day in the city center. Unfortunately, when my parents were about to leave, their car wouldn't start. They asked if they could borrow my rental car for the day. I couldn't say no, even though that meant I'd be stuck here alone for the whole day. They left, and I just hung out all day at their house. I took another walk around the neighborhood, but the people I walked past seemed a lot less friendly to me without my parents around. No one waved. Everyone just glared at me suspiciously. It's kind of weird. So I cut my walk short and went back inside. My parents didn't have a TV in the house, so I scrolled through my phone for a while and read some of my mom's magazines that she kept in the bathroom. It was really boring. As I heated up some leftovers from the fridge, I heard noises from the house next door. It sounded like they were having a barbecue. It smelled delicious. I remembered meeting the couple who lived next door. Barbara and Frank, I think. They seemed nice the day before, so I wondered if I could just invite myself over. Mom had always talked about how the community was so close, how people could just drop in unannounced. I normally didn't do that kind of thing, but I was pretty bored and lonely. So I put the leftovers back in the fridge and walked into the backyard. I looked over the fence toward Barbara and Frank and said hello. I told them that I was home alone while my parents were off visiting a sick friend. I figured that was the most diplomatic way of seeing if I could come over. Barbara whispered something to Frank, and he nodded gravely. Neither of them were smiling. After a long moment, they asked if I wanted to join them. Seemed a little awkward, though, like I was forcing them to invite me. I headed next door and instantly realized that something was off. Everyone got really quiet when I walked in. Their friendly smiles from earlier were replaced by suspicious glares. I tried to make small talk with the other neighbors, but they all avoided me. Frank announced that the meat was ready, and then everyone grabbed paper plates and formed a line near the barbecue. I got in line, but Barbara tapped me on the shoulder and said that she had something special for me. She handed me a burger that was already made. "This one is just for you," she said. "You're our guest, so you get the best piece." There was something about her tone of voice that unnerved me. I took the plate and thanked her. I was about to take a bite when I noticed that literally everyone at the barbecue was staring at me. I wondered if Barbara had spat in my burger or something. Maybe they didn't like having visitors. Maybe they didn't want anyone my age intruding on their community. I pulled off the bun, and I couldn't see any spit globs or anything. I started nibbling around the edges of the burger, careful not to bite into the meat. "Do you like it?" Barbara asked. I told her it was delicious. Then she waited for me to take another bite. I really didn't trust her. I had to think of an excuse to get out of there. I told her that I'd left my parents' stove on and had to run back. It was kind of a lame excuse, but I think she bought it. "Take the burger with you," she said. I did, though I had no intention of actually eating it. As I rushed off, I could hear the whole group whispering about me. When I got back inside, I threw out the burger. I didn't go back to the barbecue, of course. I could still hear their voices next door, and I could tell that the barbecue was still going strong, but I knew that I needed to stay away. I wasn't wanted. About an hour later, the voices stopped. I assumed the party was over, but I saw some movement through the window. I looked out and saw Frank, Barbara, and at least 5 other neighbors sneaking into my parents' backyard. They obviously didn't want me to hear them because they were looking around and whispering. I ducked under the window so they couldn't see me, and I tried to listen to what they were whispering. "Do you think she's asleep yet?" I heard Frank whisper. "I put enough medication in there to knock her out for hours," Barbara answered. So I was right. She had put something in my burger, but it wasn't spit. It was a sleep-inducing medicine. But why? I could hear them slowly opening the window right behind me. They were going to sneak in. I dropped onto the ground and hid behind the couch. Frank climbed through the window first, but the others weren't far behind. They kept giggling, like they were having the time of their lives. What was their plan? What did they want to do to me? From my hiding place, I could see them walk around the living room and start trashing the place. They upended furniture and shattered plates on the floor. Barbara even took down my parents' framed wedding photo and slammed it into the wall, spraying glass everywhere. I needed to call the police before they found me, but I didn't have my phone. I left it on the table. I looked up and saw that Frank had grabbed my phone. I don't know how he'd gotten through my password, but somehow he did. He was typing something until Barbara took the phone away from him. "Let me write her goodbye note," she said. "You find her and finish her off." So that was the plan. They wanted to kill me, trash the house, and make it look like I'd had some self-destructive breakdown. I couldn't just hide there and let it happen. Even though they outnumbered me by 6-1, I had to fight them. I jumped out of my hiding spot and dove toward Barbara. She instantly dropped my phone and fell backwards. The other neighbors must have been so surprised by my sudden appearance that they raced out of there, leaving me alone with Barbara and Frank. I grabbed a lamp to use as a weapon. "What did I ever do to you?" I screamed. Barbara, still on the floor, answered. "You didn't do anything. But your psycho mother and her HOA meddling has made our lives miserable." So when I was with my parents, these people weren't actually friendly. They were just walking on eggshells to keep my mom happy. But now that my parents were gone, they were taking their anger out on me. All of this was because of a stupid HOA. Frank dove toward me, but I was too fast for him. I slammed the lamp into his head, knocking him unconscious. It was almost too easy. Barbara stood up, angry and horrified at what I'd done to her husband. "You bitch!" she screamed. She grabbed a shard of glass off the floor. The lamp was shattered into pieces, so I no longer had a weapon. She came at me, and I backed away. I stumbled over the trash can and fell onto the floor. The poisoned hamburger that I'd thrown out earlier flopped out of the trash. As Barbara crouched over me, ready to strike with the glass, I picked up the hamburger and shoved it into her mouth. "Eat it!" I screamed. "Eat it!" At that exact moment, my parents came back home. They'd left the hospital early. They saw the total destruction around their house and screamed. I'd never felt so happy to see them in my life. It's been a year since this all went down. Barbara and Frank are still serving time for attempted murder, but their other conspirators got lighter sentences. My parents sold the house and moved back to their old neighborhood. When I retire, I will never live in a gated community like that. It makes people go crazy. The machine was unassuming in construction, even smaller than I had imagined it would be when I had seen the prototype online. The reviews had been stellar, and all of the time tourists that had used it seemed enthusiastic to try it in other spheres of their lives where they had left less than satisfying memories. I was sure my life would change when I flicked the switch on. Still, my heart did not stop beating as frazzled nerves exerted itself all over my body. I dropped the coffee mug I held onto the table as gently as I could. "Shit," I cussed nonchalantly, assessing the gray appliance with a fleeting glance just once. Then I flicked the switch, damning all consequences. The machine revved to a light, igniting an illuminating white glow that grew larger from the middle to form a portal. The temptation was instantaneous, and my skin tingled in disbelief. It was real, and it was working, I thought to myself as I took one step forward. The buzzing glow of light drew me in with such warmth that affected my senses. It was bliss. Pure ecstasy, if I had ever felt it. In one moment, it felt like a cocoon of warmth, and in a split second, it sucked me in with the harshness of glass shards piercing through my skin. I cried loudly, bent over with my hands over my ears and my eyes shut to manage the pain. Suddenly, the pain stopped. My beating heart intimated me of my immediate consciousness, and when I opened my eyes, I was in that familiar pink room with all of my things just the way I recalled them to be. The walls were pink, and the bed was neatly arranged. My life-size teddy was on the bed, just how I always placed it. "What?" I blurted in puzzlement. My stomach growled. I turned around to face the mirror on the wall, and there my image was, being myself again and 16 years old. I pinched my face, and it hurt. Ow! "Honey?" My mother's voice, tender and smooth, came muffled through the door. The hinge moved, and the door was open. My stomach sank when I saw my mother for the first time in what was an uncountable eternity. The confusion in my mother's eyes made me stiffen up, sniffling back on the tears in my eyes and the stinging snort in my nostrils. "Did you hurt yourself, baby?" my mom asked. "No." I paused, and my voice broke in surrender. "No, Mom." "Oh, Claire, you don't have to come with us if you don't want to." My mom followed up on the worried look on my face. "Your dad and I will be back before nightfall." I nodded my head. Realization hit me like a train to the midsection. In a lifetime I was familiar with, I had gone with my parents, and we had been attacked by a gun-wielding psychopath. I had escaped with my life, but the killer, Jonas Cornell, had butchered both my parents. I had been able to testify in his conviction, but that was a different lifetime. The horrors of reminiscing hurt my stomach, and I threw my body on the bed. Before I could turn around, my mom let out a sigh to leave me alone, and the door was pulled shut. From where I lay on the bed, I heard both my parents converse briefly before the car started up. The engine got louder as they left in a weird twist of reality until the crude noise drowned my senses. I shut my eyes briefly to stop the noise from the engine and the tears from my eyes. When I opened them, I was back in my room with the time machine in front of me. But everything else was different. The smell of rotten food wafted to my nostrils, and it gagged me violently. On the table, where I recalled I had dropped my coffee, a moldy slice of pizza was falling off. A bottle of vodka, half drunk, also occupied the table. I scowled in horror. "What the F?" I blanched, and my breath smelled like alcohol. My entire body numbed. And it was because of all things, I never drank alcohol. No, no, no! I jumped at the machine as a time tourist for another round of experience with tears in my eyes. My second course went by quickly, and, just as I expected, I was in the room again. I rushed to the mirror, following the routine unwittingly, and I pinched my face. "Ow!" I cried. "Honey?" My mother, almost in the same manner she had appeared those times, was back. "Did you hurt yourself, baby?" My eyes turned steely. I turned to her. "You don't have to go, Mom. You and Dad. You don't have to go anywhere today," I wheezed, desperately rushing over to her and pulling her to the bed. She followed under my compelling pull to the bed. "You don't have to come with us if you—" "I don't have to go! Neither you nor Dad have to go!" I said, observing how my mom searched my eyes for any strange effects. "I don't do stuff, or alcohol, or smoke, Mom!" My father appeared from the door and poked his head through. He asked what was holding both of his favorite ladies up. My mom sighed and said I was acting strange. I grinned with relief when she took my side and mentioned the need to cancel. "It's the game of the season, Margaret! Come on, you both—" He slammed the door before he finished his statement and started into a rant. My mom tapped her hands on my shoulder and asked for a moment to speak to him. She left, but the noise only grew louder and louder until I could not contain it. I shut my eyes and opened them. And I was back in my room with a mysterious old lady cussing at me aggressively. Pure dread attacked her body as I watched that toothless mouth spew venom at her from the couch. The face was undeniably my mother's, but the bile was unrecognizable. She said I had let my father die, and I was horrible. She was angry. Angry that was intense enough that it made her old face red with heat. "No, no, no!" I hollered as my thumping heart racked my ribcage. I took another chance with the time machine, realizing there was only one way to live with my tragedy, and it was to accept my full story for what it was. I stepped into the time machine, and I was back in the room, rounding back to the mirror and pinching my face. I yowled, and my mother appeared. Watched the entire motion from my own body like a spectator, and the truth of the time machine struck me. It was not designed to change the past, as any change had its effect on the present. Either way was more miserable than the other. At least I had lived a more familiar one. The horror of knowing my parents would die on the way to the game, at the exact time it would happen, and the horrible villain who would kill them made me cry. But I relieved myself of the burden of choice, and simply enjoyed my mother's warmth for the last time, and my father's strength when he took a bullet to the stomach to give me enough room to escape the killer's muzzle. I broke the loop when I allowed things to be, and I was back to my room with the coffee on the table. My horrors finally ceased.
When Lisa told me she heard strange noises from underneath the floor of our apartment, it was hard to believe her. It was a very new apartment, and we had spent thousands of dollars in renovation, taking it from the rundown construction that it was before and turning it into something more beautiful that we could all live in. Perhaps it was for this reason that I did not believe her, even though I should have. Unlike Lisa, I did not come from a wealthy background. I lived with my mother in a dirt-poor neighborhood, in a project building that houses more people than we care to know. Moving into an estate where we did not share walls with neighbors was a dream for me after college, and I got to share this new apartment and this new life with Lisa. It was like a fairy tale that my childhood eyes would have been proud to see, but Lisa insisted that she heard noises from the floor of our home. Lisa, we live in a bungalow, and there are no houses underneath us. We have a garage and no basement. I resisted her as much as I could, and sometimes we would fight over it, but Lisa never wavered. So I thought to ask around if anyone else had experienced such challenges in their homes when they first moved into their new apartments. Neatly tarred roads, scarcely ever littered, like the ghetto homes I lived in all my life. I would kiss my teeth in annoyance that Lisa was forcing me to think that getting the new apartment was a bad idea. The neighborhood was so exclusive that we hardly ever saw our neighbors. But on the day I saw Randall, I knew I had to ask the question. Randall was a quaint fellow who lived for loud foreign music. So when I saw him shave his lawn with huge shears instead of a mower, it didn't startle me. I chalked it up to a cultural preference. Hey, Randall, do you sometimes hear noises from the floor of your building? I asked after I eased myself with the situation. Randall seemed puzzled and went over the question I asked with his own lips wordlessly for a while before telling me that he had never a reason to suspect that there were noises from underneath the floor of his house. He chuckled and said the music he played was always so loud anyway. In my head, it was settled, and Lisa was only making a fuss over the new apartment. I told him that it was just Lisa's worry, and he laughed some more. Women, he snickered. Randall and I bantered about sports and life. He told me that, just like me, he claimed that the life he had now was an upgrade for what he used to have. South Africa was a strange place for him. Even though he was in South Africa all his life, moving to America was an easy choice. Randall and I concluded that America had its perks, and we must concern ourselves with enjoying it. Then I left him and thought nothing of the incident, until that strange night came. It had to be past 1 a.m., or sometime so far into dusk, when I heard Lisa scream from somewhere in the house, a shriek so loud that my heart snapped and I jerked up from the bed. I still struggled with sleep, but Lisa's desperate cry echoing around the house made my head spin. I rushed from the room and straight after the noise into the kitchen, where I was met with the shock of my life. The first emotion that washed over me was utter confusion. "Randall!" I barked, shook to my bones by the sight of our neighbor in our kitchen. A neighbor in one's kitchen is not wholly a bad-sounding idea, but the circumstances around it made me numb. The steel reflected light into my eyes. He had Lisa in his hands, and I was terrified to my bones what he would do to her. "David, help me!" Lisa cried in horror, and I noticed a gash on the side of her face. The blood on the wound had clotted and did not bleed as heavily to be fatal. Randall looked at me with a menacing glare in his eyes. "When I was much younger, I would do your wife right here while you watching, slit her throat and walk out that door," Randall said, in the most horrifying string of words to hit my ears. The most I would get was a fine from the judge. My spinning head spun faster. I didn't understand. The wind blowing into the kitchen blew even colder, and the hair on my skin stood up. I looked around the kitchen, and my eyes fell upon the huge hole on the floor that Randall must have crawled out of. My heart sank from my chest to my stomach. Perhaps he knew I had seen it, and laughed at my realization. To impress it in, he put his knife on Lisa's arm and slashed it. Lisa fell to the floor in tears. Did 5 years in prison and can't get a job. For what? Killing? I loved it, but it ruined my life. I will get my lick back, he said, and my heart pounded in my chest like 1,000 drums going off all at the same time. He grabbed her hair, and I stopped thinking. The terror in her cry when he placed his knife on her throat. I had no doubt in my heart that this psychopath was in frenzy and would kill her. I was so afraid that my whole body was shaking, and I knew that I just could not simply watch him kill Lisa. Adrenaline pumped through my veins, propelled me forward, and I jumped him. He turned his knife mid-swing to stab me. The knife ate into my forearm, but I wasn't thinking. I wrestled the handle with him forcefully and pulled the blade out of his hand, then turned on him and stabbed him deep in the chest. Randall held his wound and stumbled backwards, choking on blood as he fell to the floor. Looking around the room, Lisa wasn't there. I called out for her, but she came back with her phone in her hand. "The police will be here any minute," she said, rushing into my arms. The cops did not take their time and came as soon as they could, and the emergency services came moments later to take us to the hospital for medical care. I apologized to Lisa for not listening to her, and she forgave me. But it was the most horrifying night of my life, one which I knew I could not afford a repeat of.
I've been cleaning houses for 25 years. Back in my 20s, I was strapped for cash, and someone offered me a job to clean their house. I took it, and they asked me back. Eventually, I became a cleaner full-time because it made me just enough money to get by, which is all I needed. Don't get me wrong, I've seen some disgusting things, but I actually quite enjoy it. It gives me a lot of satisfaction to scrub something until it shines. The clients are what makes the job difficult. Tracy, may she rest in peace, was particularly bad. I don't want to speak ill of the dead, but she stood out as a bad customer. She would breathe down our necks while we cleaned her house. I often wanted to tell her to step back and let us do our job, but I kept a tight lip. Whenever her house was on the schedule, I knew I was in for a day. I remember mentally preparing for Tracy the last time I cleaned her home. I woke up to a text from my manager telling me that Shonda called out again, so I would have to clean the property alone. Shonda called out a lot, so I wasn't fazed. I made sure to pack my headphones so I could listen to my romance novel while I cleaned. I've gotten to a point where, as long as there aren't too many properties for that day, I kind of enjoy working alone. I had 2 properties to clean. A 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom condo in Tracy's beautiful big house. Cleaning Tracy's house felt like a mammoth task, but I asked my manager if I could get paid overtime and she agreed. As long as the money was there, I didn't mind the extra work. The condo didn't take me too long, about 3.5 hours. I mentally prepared for Tracy's to take 6 to 7 hours. She lived in a 2-story home with a basement. Altogether, there are 4 bedrooms and 4 bathrooms. Along with 2 large living areas, a dining room, and a massive kitchen. Lots of area to cover. Normally, Tracy would greet us at the door before we even had a chance to knock. This was not one of those times, so I rang the doorbell. There was no answer, so I knocked. Again, no answer. I called my manager to let them know no one was home and I couldn't get in. She told me where to find a lockbox with a key and the code so I could let myself in, which is standard for people who hire cleaners who can't be home when we come. It felt so weird to be in that house alone. Tracy always had to be there to ensure we didn't miss a single speck of dust. I wondered where she was. I yelled out, "Hello," to see if anyone would respond. Maybe she took a nap and forgot to set an alarm for us. I did this a couple more times before deciding I was alone and got to cleaning. I put in my headphones and started to work in the kitchen. Every now and again while I cleaned, I heard a faint clamoring. I didn't think much of it at the time. It was an older house, and you know how those creak and wane. Plus, they lived on a fairly busy street, so I continued to work through it. The first story alone took me about 3 hours. Once it was sparkling, I made my way up the stairs. I grabbed my all-purpose cleaner and rag and started with a handrail going up the stairs. About halfway up, I noticed a dark liquid gathering at the top of the stairs. I stopped at the handrail and went to investigate. dark red liquid formed a stream that stopped at the rug running along the upstairs hallway. When the rug could absorb no more, the blood began to crawl down the edge of it. I took out my headphones and put them in my pocket. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911 just in case. I followed that stream to the primary bedroom. On the way, I heard a clunk and froze. That noise definitely didn't come from the street. It was coming from inside the house. My heart began to race and my hands grew wet with sweat. I had to use the rag in my pocket to dry them off as I inched closer to the source of the blood. I pushed the primary bedroom door open, then pushed myself up against the wall beside the door to peer around the corner. When the coast appeared clear, I entered. The bedroom looked normal. The bed needed to be made, and I needed to pick up the clothes the couple had strewn across the room. But nothing suspicious other than the trail of blood. There were large blood smears on the carpets, like someone dragged a dead body through the room. I tiptoed my way to the bathroom. As I turned the corner, I saw a single limp foot hanging out of the tub. At the sight, I stepped back, which was when I realized a man was behind me. He grabbed me from behind, so I elbowed him in the stomach. He lurched over in pain. When he looked up at me, I sprayed him in the eyes with my cleaning spray and kicked him in the nuts. I couldn't go back to check on Tracy. I had to get out of there and call the cops. I dashed down the stairs, out the door, and called the authorities. They arrived at the scene within minutes. It turned out to be a crime of passion. The man who grabbed me was Tracy's secret boyfriend. She decided she could no longer cheat on her husband and tried to break things off with him. She wanted to repair her marriage and be a good mom to her kids. But if he couldn't have her, no one could. According to the police, Tracy died of blunt force trauma to her head. He hit her with something with a sharp edge, which is why there was so much blood. My manager offered our services to clean Tracy's house free of charge for the family's sake. For obvious reasons, she didn't have me do it. She had another cleaning team take care of it. Tracy was a handful, but no one deserved to die like she did. My boyfriend Ken broke up with me about a month ago. It came as a huge surprise. I thought we were really happy together, but he said that he hadn't been happy for a while. He explained that his family disapproved of our relationship, but I knew that was a lie. I never even met his family. One of the biggest adjustments I had to make was figuring out how to live alone. I grew up with a big family. Then I moved into the college dorms. Then I moved in with Ken. For the first time ever, I was now living alone, and I didn't like it. I had trouble falling asleep. Every single noise in the house would wake me up. I spent hours lying in my bed, worried that some criminal had broken in. My oldest sister, Pamela, told me to try sleeping pills, at least for a couple weeks. I didn't like that idea, but after 3 nights of barely any sleep, I decided to give it a try. After ordering takeout for dinner, I got ready for bed and took my first sleeping pill. It seemed to work instantly. I was completely knocked out, and I didn't wake up until close to 10 the next morning. I felt really well rested, but as I got ready for the day, I remembered the strange dreams I had throughout the night. I dreamt that Ken had come back and just wandered around my house, running his fingers along the wall and staring at me from the edge of the room. The dream seemed so vivid, I could only assume that it was the result of the sleeping pill. I went to work as normal, and when I came back home that night, I tried the sleeping pill once again. Like the night before, I fell asleep right away and had the same strange dream. In my dream, I was lying frozen in my bed while Ken walked around my room, staring at me. Even though I've gotten pretty good sleep for both nights, I decided to stop taking the sleeping pill. I didn't want to keep dreaming about my ex. So the next night, I went to bed naturally. Not surprisingly, I could not get to sleep at all. No matter how long I stayed lying in my bed, my brain wouldn't calm down enough for me to sleep. I just lied there with my eyes closed. But then, in the middle of the night, I heard footsteps inside my house. I knew I was still awake, so it wasn't another dream. This was real. I opened my eyes just a little bit and saw a figure walk into my room. It was Ken. That's when I knew that my dreams from the last 2 nights were real. Ken had snuck into my house 3 nights in a row, and I had no idea why. He wasn't stealing anything. He wasn't trying to contact me. He was just walking around. I shivered under my covers. I was terrified. I didn't think that Ken would want to hurt me, but I also didn't know why he was trespassing. I laid there frozen and waited. After about half an hour, Ken casually walked out of the room. The next morning, I decided to find Ken and confront him. I needed answers. So I drove to his family house, where I knew he was staying with his parents and brother. Then I knocked on the door. Ken answered right away, and he seemed surprised to see me. I demanded to know what was going on, but he just looked at me like I was crazy. He had no idea what I was talking about. I told him that I'd seen him sneaking around in my house at night. His eyes got really wide and he looked terrified. "That wasn't me," he said. "I know it was you," I said. "Why are you doing that?" "You can't stay there anymore," he said. "Get out of that house, now." He was going to say something else, but then he stopped. Someone else had just entered the room behind him, but I couldn't see who it was. He told me that I had to get out of there, and then he slammed the door in my face. After that, I was more confused than ever. I didn't follow his advice though, and I went back to my house. I refused to live in fear of my ex. I went to bed as usual, and I did not take any sleeping medicine. This time though, I kept my phone under my pillow. As soon as I heard anything, I'd call the police. I stayed in bed and waited for any noise. I didn't have to wait long. Just after sunset, I heard footsteps in my living room. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. As the footsteps got closer, I whispered into the phone that someone had broken into my house. I gave the lady my address and then hung up the phone just as my bedroom door creaked open. I watched through half-closed eyes as Ken once again walked through my bedroom. I could see him touching my things and opening my underwear drawer to smell what was inside. I prayed that the police would get there soon. Ken walked closer to my bed. He watched me for a long moment before slowly reaching down to touch my shoulder. All I could do was hold my breath and pray. I felt his hand slide along to the top of the blanket. Just then, sirens blared from outside. The police had arrived. Ken jumped back and then raced toward the window. I watched as he dove out the window and tried to run away. After he was gone, I heard 2 gunshots and then silence. With the police just outside, I got out of bed and looked out the window. I saw Ken lying dead on the ground, 2 bullet holes in his stomach. Several policemen had gathered around him. One of them noticed me looking out the window and walked over to explain what had happened. He said that they caught my intruder trying to escape and they had no choice but to shoot him. They asked if I knew who it was, and I told them that it was my ex-boyfriend, Ken. But when I looked closer at the body, I realized that it wasn't Ken at all. It looked like him, but he was shorter and fatter. His eyes were darker too. That was when another car pulled up to my house and the real Ken came out. He ran toward the body and then wailed in sadness. "You killed my brother!" he screamed at the police. Ken was completely freaking out, and the police had to handcuff him before he'd calm down. Ken finally explained the truth. He never wanted to break up with me. The only reason he did was because his younger brother Carl had become obsessed with me. I never met his brother before, but they looked so similar that I'd mistaken them for each other. Carl had just been released from a mental institution, had seen photos of me, and then started following me around. Ken thought that breaking up with me would make Carl lose his obsession, but it only made things worse. I felt so sorry for Ken. Even though his brother was a psycho, he didn't deserve to die. Over the next few weeks, Ken tried to reconnect multiple times. I always turned him down. I didn't know if he wanted to get back together and restart a relationship, but I wasn't interested. Every time I saw his face, I picture his brother quietly walking through my house at night. hate Times Square. It's filled with slow-moving tourists and people dressed as characters harassing you to take a picture with them. Last year, I was running late to see The Phantom of the Opera on Broadway when I got caught in a slow Times Square tourist herd. I had about 10 minutes before the start of the show, so I had to book it. Normally, I would be patient and go with the slow flow of traffic, but this time I couldn't. Using my elbows, I weaseled my way through the crowd. As I maneuvered through, I could tell people thought I was being rude. That's life sometimes, I guess. Right when I was about to break out of the pack of people, one of them said, excuse you? I turned around to apologize, and I explained I was running late for the show. I turned back around to run to the theater when I ran into Woody, the Toy Story character. Together, we fell to the ground. He put his arms around me as we tumbled. Suddenly, I was on my back with a massive Woody on top of me. I looked through the mesh of the eyes and could almost make out deep blue eyes behind them. He lingered on top of me. I shoved him off and tried to ask if he was okay. He sat up and continued to stare at me in silence. I apologized for running into him and headed towards my show. I made it just in time for the grand chandelier to rise from the stage over the heads of the audience. When the show was over, I walked out and there was a Woody character waiting. The hair on my neck stood up. I wondered if it was the same one as before, but there are so many of these characters running around. I convinced myself it was a different one and didn't give it another thought. I headed towards the train. When I walked out to the center of Times Square, I saw 4 other Woody characters. Seeing so many gave me some peace. The chances it was that specific Woody I ran into were probably small. I continued on my way. When I got on the train, some street performers were dancing in the aisle. As I watched them, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a big Woody head gazing in my direction. My heart skipped a beat. I looked closer and realized it was just the head of the costume. The man wearing it had taken the head off and looked ahead. Woody's eyes were fixed on me. I felt uneasy but told myself again it was a coincidence. There's so many of these characters running around. Still, I got off a stop early, even if it meant more walking. If that man followed me, I didn't want him to know what stop I got off at. I walked off the train and looked around to look at the man dressed as Woody one more time. This time, he was looking at me. He had dark hair and light blue eyes. His stare was intense. It felt like he was looking through me at my soul and knew my deepest, darkest secrets. His eyes remained on me as the train zoomed off. I got home as fast as I could, constantly looking over my shoulder for someone following me. I told my roommates about it and they all thought it was a funny, lighthearted story. A Woody stalking me home. Haha. Even though it gave them a good laugh, that man's face haunted me as I fell asleep. His stare was so fanatical. His eyes didn't leave me as the train left the station. In the following weeks, I looked over my shoulder more. There were times when I had a strong feeling someone was watching me. I looked for the man's face in the people I passed walking down the street. When I worked in coffee shops, I looked at every person to see if he was there. I did this on the train too. Some nights, I dreamed of him staring at me. I would wake up in a cold sweat. I was so anxious, but I had no real reason to think someone was following or watching me. It's not like I ever noticed someone walking behind me or noticed the same face in the places I went. I talked to my friends about it to try to shake the feeling. They laughed at the idea of the Woody man following me. I understand the humor, but I couldn't shake the nerves. A couple more weeks passed, and I stopped being so nervous. The uneasiness began to fade. I still felt like someone was watching me at times, but I was able to convince myself it was nothing. One night, my roommates convinced me to go out with them. I used to go out with them a lot, but when I had the whole incident with the Woody fellow, I started staying in out of paranoia. I was excited to go out. I wore my new black satin halter dress and was ready to blow off some steam.
You say I make you nervous, a tragedy, I'm a beautiful disaster.
Some finance bros were with us and bought us shots all night. We danced, laughed, and were having a great time. But as the night progressed, my paranoia started to creep in again. I scanned the room for those cold blue eyes I saw on the train, and I didn't see them. I told myself I was just anxious from drinking, and I tried to continue having a good time. I decided some dancing would do me good. So I grabbed one of the finance guys and headed to the dance floor. His name was Jerry. The beat flowed through both of us. I looked up from the floor to see the guy I grabbed dancing with another girl. Who was I dancing with? I turned around and saw the man from the train. I gasped and stepped back. But before I could get a good distance between us, he grabbed my wrist and pulled me into him. "I've been waiting for us to meet again like this," he said into my ear. I got a whiff of his breath, and it was awful. He reeked of raw hot dogs. I tried to pull away, but he just pulled me closer. "I've been watching ever since we first met. You remember me, right, baby?" I tried to push him, but his grip was too strong. "We can be together. I knew you were the one when I looked into your eyes for the first time." I wanted to vomit. I tried to talk to him. "I'm sorry, I don't know you. Please let me go." "No," he growled. "You're mine. I have you now." "I'm not yours," I yelled, breaking away from his grip. Jerry saw what was happening and left the girl he was dancing with. "Is there a problem?" he asked. The man tried to pull me away, but Jerry stopped him. "I don't think she wants to go with you, man." The creep looked at me like he expected me to defend him. I took the opportunity to escape his grasp and hid behind my new friend. "Leave her alone," Jerry said sternly. The creep then charged at him. He tackled Jerry and everyone around us backed up. My stalker was on top of him, punching his face over and over until Jerry's face was covered in blood. Thankfully, security intervened and pulled the creep off of him. The police were called because of the fight. The Woody character spent the night in jail. Jerry ended up pressing charges against the Woody character. Turns out his name was Ronald. I was able to get his information to file a restraining order in case he ever came near me again. I haven't seen him since, but I can't help but scan every room I enter for his icy blue eyes.
I couldn't believe my eyes when I saw the apartment listing. It was a 1-bed, 1-bath, a spacious updated kitchen, and an in-unit washer and dryer, all for $1,000 a month. Usually apartments like that go for at least $1,300, and that's if it's dingy. When I toured it, it wasn't the cleanest, and certain spots had a putrid smell. The leasing agent promised that it would be clean before I moved in. They said that I might need to do some cleaning myself, but that they would deal with the smell. The agent seemed eager to get someone to move in as soon as possible. It was everything I wanted and, well, under my budget. So I signed the lease and moved in as soon as the leasing agent would let me. On move-in day, the apartment was still pretty dirty. I knew I would have an oasis once I cleaned up that layer of grime, but after a string of poor living situations and bad roommates, I wanted to create a space where I could unwind and relax. Once all my boxes were moved in, I got to cleaning. I started in the kitchen and then moved to the bathroom. When I was cleaning the floor in the bathroom, I discovered one of the rectangle tiles was loose. It wiggled in its mold. I went and got a fork and I was able to flip it up. To my surprise, there was something nuzzled into the hole. I pulled out a leather-bound notebook with a skull drawn on the cover with what looked like a ballpoint pen. Before I opened the notebook, it felt heavy in my hands. Something about it creeped me out. Like, why go through so much trouble to hide a notebook? As I started to inspect it, I understood why. The book was filled with entries that dated back decades. Each entry was a description of a person. It included their age, approximate height and weight, physical appearance, disposition, routines, and some miscellaneous information. Most entries had a lock of hair taped onto the page. Others had a small necklace or a bracelet. It seemed like a trophy notebook of a serial killer, and I wasn't even being dramatic. I read one entry where the man described how he killed the person. It was too disturbing to repeat, but I'll say it involved skinning the person while they were still alive. I immediately went to the police station to turn it in. Whoever made that journal could still possibly be out there. The police appreciated that I brought it straight to them. I told them where I found it and gave them the number of the leasing agent. The killer must have lived in that apartment at one point or another. The police told me that they would update me if they found anything out. On my way home, I wondered about it. If the killer lived in my apartment at some point, why he would leave his precious murder notebook. Did he live there 5 years ago or a month ago? You would think that the notebook itself would be the first thing you grab as you packed up to move out, but how could you forget it? Did he kill someone in my apartment? Is that why I got it for so cheap? Before returning to the apartment, I stopped at the leasing office to ask questions about the previous tenant. When I walked in, the leasing agent seemed peeved to see me. "You talked to the police?" she asked as I walked in. Yeah, I found something disturbing underneath one of the bathroom tiles, and I had to report it. It was literally the journal of all these people that somebody had killed. I wish you would have brought this to me first. Cops sniffing around isn't good for business, and it freaks out other tenants. Yeah, I'm sorry about that, but I thought I was doing the right thing. Can I ask you some questions about the apartment and the previous tenant? This whole thing is kind of freaking me out. The leasing agent shrugged, but I went on to ask questions about it. She explained that he was evicted because his neighbors kept making noise complaints, and some complained about a smell emanating from his apartment. According to her, the guy waited until the very last minute to move out, so they had to throw out a ton of stuff before listing it to be rented. I asked for his name, but she said that she couldn't disclose that to me. She already told the police. Well, how long has it been since he left? About 2 months, she said. Although I was satisfied with the information that she gave me, I was still unnerved by the whole thing. I continued unpacking my apartment over the next couple days. I wanted it to feel like home, but I couldn't stop my mind from running horrible scenarios that could have happened there from the previous tenant. It's hard to unwind when you can't stop wondering if a murder took place where you're sitting. It wasn't even a simple murder that could have taken place either. It would have been horrific, where the killer took their time and inflicted as much pain and terror as possible. Sitting there on my couch, I thought there very well could have been more than just one of these kind of slayings. I couldn't sleep after that, so I decided to spend the night at a hotel. I realized I couldn't stay at a hotel every night because I was locked into a year-long lease. I had to try to make the best of it. My sister is into this new age spirituality stuff, so she suggested that I try to cleanse the place. She gave me what she used to cleanse her space. I don't know if it worked, but it did help me feel better, to the point where I could sleep there again. A couple nights later, I was awoken by a shattering noise in the middle of the night. I shot up in bed to look around. I heard heavy boots trudging through my living area. I grabbed my phone and hid in the closet behind some empty boxes. I was breathing as quietly as possible, listening to the intruder walk around my place. I heard him move to the bathroom. The intruder grumbled some before letting out what sounded like a loud growl. Then, I heard the mirror shatter. He started trashing the place. He went back out into the living room, and I could hear him throwing things around. I hunched over in the closet, called 911 and told them that there was an intruder. They instructed me to stay on the phone. There I sat behind an empty box in my closet, trying to be as quiet as a madman thrashed through my apartment. Once the killer was satisfied with the damage he caused in my living room, he moved into my bedroom. I stopped breathing. I could see his silhouette through the closet door. He was holding a kitchen knife and started stabbing my mattress. I put my hand over my mouth. He walked up to my closet and ripped the door open. I tried to shrink in the darkness as much as I could. Somehow, I was able to hide well enough that he slammed the closet door and continued. I heard him trudge back through the window that he broke and crawled out. He was gone by the time the police arrived. I could not stay in the apartment after that. Fortunately, the leasing company took pity on me and released me from my lease so I could at least find a new place without any cost. After the police investigated some, they told me that there was, in fact, a serial killer that they had been tracking for 2 years. The journal was a breakthrough for them, and they were able to use it to rope in the FBI for help. Now the man is on the FBI most wanted list. When they heard that he had broken into my apartment to receive his journal, they couldn't believe my luck. I was this close to becoming the freshest diary entry.
Back when I was in my late 20s, I worked the night shift at a local nursing home. The job wasn't particularly hard, and most of the time it was fairly dull, but there was one incident that stuck with me for many years after I quit. It had been an uneventful start to the shift. I was in the nurse's station, drinking coffee to keep me awake while keeping an eye on the monitors and filling out some paperwork in between. We had motion sensors out in the halls and alarms on the doors in case anyone tried to get in or out, and every resident had a button they could press if they required assistance. It was very rare we had any sort of incident, but we were always required to be on alert just in case. It had just gone 3 a.m., and I was in the middle of filling out some forms when the motion lights in the hallway flickered on. The nurse's station was at the very end of the corridor, with a large glass window looking out into the hall where residents resided. I glanced up from my computer, expecting to see one of the residents or another nurse, but the corridor was empty. I shrugged it off at first, since the motion sensor could be finicky and sensitive at times, so I figured something small must have set it off. After a few minutes, the lights flickered off again, plunging the hallway into darkness. Only, the glow from the nurse's station lights filtered out into the gloom. The second time the lights went off, I started to wonder if I was missing something. I climbed out of my chair and left the station, glancing down the hallway. I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. None of the residents' doors were open, and nobody was out of bed. Maybe there was something faulty with the wiring. I'd heard one of the other nurses say that before. Shrugging to myself, I went back to the station and finished my work on the computer, barely noticing when the lights flickered back off. Apart from the occasional sound of my fingers tapping the keyboard or sipping from my flask, the place was deathly quiet. You couldn't even hear the wind outside. It almost felt like you were the only one in the entire building. It was so quiet, so still, that I almost jumped out of my skin when something tapped against the window of the nurse's station. I glanced up sharply, my heart stilling in my chest, to see a face staring at me from the other side of the glass. "My goodness, Mrs. Riley, you almost gave me a heart attack," I blurted, pressing a hand to my chest as I met the older woman's gaze through the window. The lady said nothing, just staring at me through the glass, her finger tapping gently against it. I got up and stepped around the partition, my earlier fright still making my breath staggered. "Is everything okay, Mrs. Riley?" "There's someone in my room," she said in her soft, raspy voice, her eyes dim and sunken amongst folds of skin. I looked at her in surprise, my throat growing dry. "There's someone in your room? What do you mean?" "Someone watching me," she wheezed. "Someone in the shadows." I gently took her arm and led her down the hallway. "Let's go have a look, shall we?" I said, trying not to frown. What did she mean there was someone in her room? No alarms had gone off, and I hadn't seen anyone enter through her door from my position. But then again, I hadn't even heard Mrs. Riley approaching the station, her bare feet muffled as they were against the carpet. I walked her back to her room and switched on the light inside. A cursory sweep confirmed that the room was empty. There was nobody there. "Where did you see this person, Mrs. Riley?" I asked. The elderly woman raised a shaky hand and pointed to the end of her bed. "There. They were watching me." Her words sent a prickle of unease down my spine. "Let's have a look." I left her standing by the doorway while I took a look around the room, checking behind the curtain and inside the closet, and even giving a brief glance underneath the bed. "There doesn't seem to be anyone here, Mrs. Riley. Maybe you were just dreaming." Mrs. Riley shook her head, a strange expression twisting her features. "It wasn't a dream. I saw someone right there." With a sympathetic smile, I helped her back into bed. "Well, they're gone now. You don't have to worry." The woman didn't seem convinced, but there wasn't much more I could do. There was clearly nobody here, no matter what she thought she saw. All right now, try and get back to sleep. I'll be out here if you need anything. I tucked the covers back around her and switched off the light, closing the door behind me. With a sigh, I went back to the nurse's station. Draining the last of the coffee from my flask, I rubbed a hand over my tired eyes and got back to finishing up my paperwork. The clock on the computer read 4:13 a.m. when one of the alarms went off. It was one of the call buttons from the resident rooms. When I checked where it was coming from, I felt my mouth go dry. It was Mrs. Riley's room. I hurriedly left my desk and crossed the hallway until I stopped outside her door. On the other side, I could hear the sound of whimpering. Switching on the light by the wall. The woman was sitting up in the bed, staring wide-eyed across the room. Her chest was rising and falling quickly, each breath slipping raggedly between her lips. "Mrs. Riley, is everything okay?" I asked, hurrying over to her. She shook her head without taking her eyes off the end of the bed. "They came back. That person. From before. I saw them again." I let out a gentle sigh. It wasn't uncommon for the residents here to see or hear things that weren't there. Dementia, Alzheimer's, even just the effects of the medication they were on. Some of it caused hallucinations or vivid dreams. I dealt with this kind of thing before. Whatever Mrs. Riley thought she was seeing, it wasn't real. "Mrs. Riley, I already checked your room, remember? There's nobody here," I said as firmly but softly as I could, trying to get her to look at me. "But I saw them," she whispered, her voice tight with desperation. "I know what I saw." I shook my head. "I promise you, you and I are the only ones in this room." She finally calmed down, her expression growing weary. "Are you sure? Are you sure there's nobody else here?" I smiled and squeezed her hand. "I promise." "Oh, okay," she finally said. "I'm sorry for bothering you." "No bother at all. I'm here as much as you need me, okay?" I left her for the second time that night, hoping that she would fall back asleep and not experience any further hallucinations. By the end of my shift at 6 a.m., I hadn't heard from Mrs. Riley again, and assumed that she must have finally managed to get some rest. Which is why, later that day, when I got a call from the nursing home explaining that Mrs. Riley had passed away in the night, I wasn't sure what to think. Had Mrs. Riley really seen something in her room after all? Or had it simply been the senseless ramblings of a dying woman?